So please help me in welcoming our first speaker, Kevin Dowling.
I tend to move around a lot when I talk, so it's indulge me. Oh, is it the screen washed out a little bit? Yeah. Okay. So while they're doing that, I want to thank Derek especially for connecting with me again. I had the privilege of addressing his class a few times over the years, and also to you can see how we can control light now. It's like completely different. So, yeah, that's right. I think it was 13 right there. Yeah, the switch. And also to Phillips, which is actually my alma mater, since they ended up acquiring Color Kinetics a number of years ago and have taken it to a whole new level as a company. So. Now, even the youngest among you, and I suspect there's some undergraduates in the audience, have actually grown up in this age of LED lighting. It may not be as prevalent as it is right now, but it's certainly growing and will continue to grow in terms of how it's used and where it's used in our lives. And I think probably the best evidence of that, if you go down the lighting aisle now down at Home Depot or Lowe's, the big DIY stores, increasing numbers, increasing percentages of the lamps sold in those stores are LEDs. More so than compact fluorescents, maybe as much as the linear fluorescents and halogens. But that number continues to increase, and it's pretty dramatic. And so what I want to do is do a quick recap. So if we look at just the past decade, and LED lighting really began in the late 90s with the advent of the first color-changing fixtures, because the white LED really wasn't commercially available in any way that produced a good quality light. It was pretty poor light, actually. But what we've seen is a major shift from indicators to illumination. And by indicator, I mean a light that you look at. It's not a light that illuminates a space that you then look at. So all of these are illumination because they're illuminating the space around us. They're not lights that we typically look at. In fact, we don't normally want to see the source when we see illumination. But if you go, just a couple of numbers. Lumens per watt is a very nice measure of the amount of light produced per electrical watt in. And just as a reference, the incandescent lamp is roughly 10 to 11 lumens per watt. Now, we were quite happy 10 years ago when we had achieved 15 lumens per watt, because that meant we were 50% more light per watt going into that lamp. But the remarkable thing is that today we're seeing 100 lumens per watt or more in lamps that are sold at stores that we can go in and buy. And then even the fixtures that are available from some of the leading lighting companies are even above that, over 100 lumens per watt in a fixture, not just the LED, which is the way it was described for many years. People would actually advertise, 90 lumens per watt, but when you actually ask them about it, well, that's just the LED inside. When you actually put it in the fixture, it's a little bit less. Well, no, it was a lot less. And so there's been in the industry quite a bit of let's say puffery, which is a way of describing things in a light that's not really the case. Through the introduction of standards within the industry, with the Department of Energy behind a variety of programs, including the lighting facts program. So if you pick up an LED lamp in a store today, it'll have a little lighting facts label. It looks a little like the nutrition label you see on food, but instead of carbohydrates or calories, it's lumens and watts. And that tells you a lot about that fixture in a way that, had that not been present, it would not have told the same story. The other remarkable thing just in the past few months is that one of the major LED manufacturers announced 300 lumens per watt. This is actually well above the theoretical for a blue LED, which uses phosphors, which is the way we get most white light today, which means, without them even saying so, they're using another mechanism to generate that much light. But one of the things you have to ask when you see a number like that, and it's remarkably high, is, okay, at what current level? How much light? What was the color temperature of that light? What were the conditions under which this light came out? And so this is great news. We just don't have a lot of details to say whether or not this is real or not, or will become real, so that we can go to Home Depot and buy a lamp that has 300 lumens per watt. I think that's probably still a few years off. The other thing that we're seeing today, if again you go into the stores, you're seeing a remarkable number of lamp types. It's no longer just the A19 Edison-based lamp. It's much more than that. You're also able to get floodlights and spots, halogen equivalents, and so forth. So all of this is a great choice for the consumer And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of what can we do next. Derek alluded to that as well. And the other thing, which is really the one thing that hinders adoption probably more than anything else, so we saw it with CFLs, we're seeing it with LEDs now, is the cost. How much are you paying for the amount of light you're buying? And so one easy metric is dollars per kilolumen. So if you think about a 100-watt bulb, it's a little over 1,000 lumens for that lamp. How much does that cost? Well, I know I can go to, I guess it's Home Depot right now. I can buy a Cree 60-watt equivalent. It costs a little under $7 because the local utility is helping to subsidize that through an incentive and rebate program, which means I'm getting down below $10 a kilolumen. This was not even possible just a few years ago. So we're starting to see some major cost reductions, which will mean increasingly that people will accept this as a substitute for a much lower cost incandescent, which in some cases you can't get anymore due to federal mandate, or compact fluorescents, which are still lower cost per lumen. The other really remarkable thing that happened this year, and actually I had actually bet against this, and I'll tell you why in a second, was the Nobel Prize recently won by Suji Nakamura and 2 other Japanese colleagues for the blue LED, the phosphor-coated blue LED, which made a big change in our life. And the reason I had bet against it was the Nobel Prize Committee, for the most part over the years, has not gone after practical applications of technologies, and they haven't typically awarded that. But in this case, it was a welcome thing, and I'm glad to have been wrong in this case. Nobel Prize is really a great endorsement of the amount of energy and research that has gone into this technology and the amount of investment in white light technology with LEDs. So very close to us, not too many blocks from here, is this very familiar setting, Times Square. Everything in this scene is indication. It's not illumination, mainly because the street lamp that's shown over here is out in the middle there. But of course, it's one of the most lit spaces in the world, and all of this has become LED, nearly all of it, not quite all of it. So that was a remarkable transformation, and it was a very good one. It saved a lot of energy, a lot of power. These things last longer. They're not having to be replaced as much. But then other things began to happen through the late 90s and early 2000s, where we began to see these color-changing LED sources before white light became readily available, and creating what are called luminous surfaces. Derek talked a little bit about walls of lights, facades of lights, and we began to see applications where designers were creating these wonderful surfaces. Now, if you went behind the scenes here and tried to figure out what was going on here, it was actually quite ugly. Because there were channels cut in concrete, there were fixtures laid in the concrete, wires everywhere. Because LEDs were not nearly as efficient as they are today, we required a lot of them. So these tended to be very expensive, very high-end installations, much more so than they are today, where you can actually use LEDs even in fairly economical situations. But it was a great trend because it was light being used in new ways. You weren't simply taking an existing source, replacing it in a table lamp or a chandelier. These luminous surface ideas were quite widely used. And then you actually went from the practical into the decorative into the sublime, where artists like James Turrell were able to create really interesting uses of light. And he talks a lot about the physicality of light and how it's used. If any of you had the opportunity to see the Guggenheim installation here last year, it was a very remarkable installation as well, and very beautiful. This is a residence in Greenwich. I worked on a number of projects with Turrell. But here's the most striking thing. I took these 2 photographs, and I took this one with the lights. Things went okay. And in this one where I screwed up and the flash went off. And I think it was really nice, actually, to see the contrast, because it's a fairly brutal place. It's buried in the bottom of a barn somewhere in Greenwich. It's a swimming pool, but it looks like a stark concrete bunker without the light that he created for it. And it's, I think, a great indication of what you can do with light in so many ways, and what people are beginning to use LEDs for in many ways. Again, most people don't have James Turrell light their house or their pool, but there are ways in which this kind of light can be used in whole new ways that wasn't possible or wasn't easily possible with existing light sources. And then we had mainstream lighting. We had white lights that could actually produce a relatively good quality light, relatively economically, and through the early 2000s, we began to see more and more and more of this. And more people got into the business, which was great. It drove down the costs, it drove more applications, and we had more and more people wanting to use LED light, especially for applications where they could not easily get to the tops of this, the North Church here in Boston, in this photograph. They could not easily get to that. One of the interesting things about this was that the lamps themselves were these old-style linear incandescent lamps. They were so old that there were no replacements existed for this, and so they had to use something else, and they chose LEDs to do that. So on the one hand, I think it's great that LEDs are now being used to mimic existing sources. But on the other hand, as I'll walk through a couple of examples, I think it's also disappointing and short-sighted that we're not doing more with that we're not creating whole new types of sources. And so I'll show you a couple of examples. So this is a Cree 60 watt, produces 800 lumens. It's equivalent to a 60 watt in color temperature, in color quality almost, not quite, but it's not really perceptible, and the amount of light coming out of it. And it does a great job as an incandescent 60 watt replacement. And you can get a 75 watt and 100 watt in the usual. I think what gets more interesting is that some small companies are actually working on new ways of controlling light that are spectrally tunable. In other words, you can actually shift the spectrum. And this gets to Derek's point about the changing room, is now I can mimic what's going on outside with a lamp that can tune itself to color temperature. In the natural world, as the sun rises and sets, it shifts color temperature dramatically throughout the day. Lighting changes from this beautiful orange and yellow to white at midday to yellow again in the evening. And we're able to actually do that. We were chatting before the talk earlier, and somebody had mentioned incandescents, which, as you know, if you dim them, they will redshift. The color temperature actually drops significantly. And I do recall that people, lighting designers, were asking for LED lamps that did the same thing. We actually created that, but there wasn't really much of a market for it. Maybe in restaurants where you want to dim them and have that redshift for a dinner conversation and so forth, but typically it wasn't a big market. But spectrally tunable sources are great in retail and a variety of other applications where you want to tune the color to show off fabric and fashion. Food, for example, looks ghastly under certain kinds of light sources, and if you're able to redshift it a little bit, it looks much, much better. So there are ways in which this is, I think, a very interesting phenomena in which you can have a light source now that can be tuned to whatever it is that you want to illuminate. This is also very interesting. It's a way of doing wireless control from your iPhone, an iOS device or Android device, to be able to control light. More for entertainment, less about sort of large established commercial installations, but it points the way toward a whole new way of controlling light, whether it be hue and value or saturation, basically. You can now adjust all three parameters of light in a way that can mimic just about any other source that you would like. I also think that's a really interesting trend and a way to do that in a way. This is still relatively expensive. It's not an impulse buy, really, but people are using those. So one of the things that we had done about 10 years ago was look at how do you reinvent the source. Every one of these sources, the threads on these, if you go back to 1882, Edison was wandering around Menlo Park in New Jersey, which is where his laboratory was. He had already created a commercial lamp. Actually, more importantly, he had created a commercial way of distributing electricity to power these systems, and that was one of the big things. And here in New York, the Pearl Street Station was the big one that powered some of the big industrialists' mansions here in New York. But one of the problems he had with the very early lamps was they kept falling out. You hung them upside down, they'd fall out. He had a number of applications like that, and he was trying to think of a way to secure them better. So he noticed that a kerosene can with the threads on it, he thought would make a great way to secure a light bulb. So he created the thread modeled on that, and it hasn't changed in about 130 years. So we're sort of stuck with that socket for a long time, and there are billions of these sockets out there, so it sort of makes sense to go after that. On the other hand, you're leaving a lot on the table. There are ways to use LED lighting in planar surfaces and flat surfaces that don't require that electromechanical connection. The other aspect to that type of connection is it's not really well suited for conducting heat, which is still an issue for some LEDs, being able to control that heat and dissipate that heat. And so the subject of new lamps comes up, new socket standards, and there's some ongoing discussion in the industry. Nothing's really solidified yet. Nothing's really made a huge impact on the market. And there are fixtures and devices that are out there that you have to sort of screw into place and hold into place that don't follow any standard model. But there are modules starting to emerge. There's the Zaga Alliance and other things that are being used by the lighting industry in small quantities, but hopefully that'll grow even more. And we'll be able to take advantage of what it is that LEDs can do very well, which is produce a great quality light. What gets really interesting is when you start to use LEDs in very different ways, that you migrate away from the A19 Edison-based lamp into surfaces that can emit light. And so this is a small company up in Vancouver which is creating printable semiconductors. They're basically taking LEDs and printing them to large flat surfaces and then creating fixtures based on those large flat surfaces of printed LEDs. So the LEDs continue to get more efficient. For a given wafer, you can take out many more light sources, and so you can produce more light per wafer than you ever could before they're carved up into the die. The other thing we're seeing are new forms of light. The traditional points, lines, and planes that we've seen over the years can now be done directly with LED sources. This is a very simple example of an LED tape strip. Very easy to use. I've in fact used it for under cabinet lighting. It produces a very good quality light, a lot of light too, depending on how many LEDs you have per distance underneath. And this gives you whole new ways. You can put this inside of something, cover it with a diffuser. You cannot see the source, but yet it produces a lot of light. And so I find these sorts of things very, very interesting, and people are producing this type of material by very long distances right now, by miles and miles of this work, and they're also dropping significantly in price. So in terms of the form factors and the way light is used, it's pretty impressive, and that evolution will continue. The difficult part about it is how do you control it, and what do you use to control it? Do you have a chip per LED? Do you have a chip that controls a set of LEDs? And so there's a whole area of work that people have invested a lot of time in, which is that of control of LEDs. The traditional theatrical model, which you can see right here on Broadway, is large consoles, large instruments, and then being able to do fades and sequences between them. They basically set up what are called scenes, and then transitions between those scenes. And this happens to a lesser extent in commercial and residential applications. But with this type of control now, we can take it down to the pixel level. And so you start to think of light as pixels. And now you can put these pixels everywhere, and then you can control them. But it's still difficult to do. It's not very cost-effective today to do this. But increasingly, all of these trends are downward. The price gets downward. The user interfaces get better. They're not as complex. And if you look at some applications today, it's as though you need an IT person to run your lighting system, and it's very challenging to do that. So in this case, I'm showing some panels with LEDs behind them. They're also a luminous surface, except that you have independently addressable elements behind that luminous surface. And that allows you to create patterns and movement now, which you can also mimic what's going on outside and have that intersection of the natural and the artificial, and do something even more interesting with it. So the lit environment now is something where you can control the entire spectrum of light, where you can control that transition of light all the time, over time. You can also control that shape of light. You can have shadows moving through a space by controlling a large number of these, and mix that with natural light in a way that is, in fact, natural, that you're not having high color temperature sources and then a very warm daylight source outside. When they mix, it doesn't look or feel quite right. We can now match that perfectly. So this is all a really fantastic way. These particular fixtures here, I believe these are it's an Italian company that makes these, and they're actually tied in through fiber, and then they have an artificial light source built within them as well. So there's a lot of things that where people are starting to combine these. So if you have a semiconductor source, you should be able to control it in a digital fashion, and in fact you can. LEDs are inherently DC devices, and you can put a microprocessor on them and control them, make them individually addressable, and create large installations which do a lot. And then you can start adding sensing to that. You can add communications to that, two-way communications as well, not just by wire, but by wireless. So it becomes much easier to do the installation. And I show one or two examples of where you can actually sense location, where you, as a person walking into a room in a building, can actually, your position can be determined. You can know where you are. So that could be used for wayfinding and so forth within a facility, and then providing more connections. So this is an example where this was done years ago for freezers, and Walmart had shifted over the lighting within the freezers to LEDs, and for a variety of reasons it was a good way to save energy. lower electrical costs and so forth. But one thing they added was essentially it was a motion sensor. Think of it as a 1-bit camera. And that camera, that sensor, all it did was sense your presence. When you showed up in front of that freezer, it turned on the lights inside of it. Because it didn't matter how often LEDs were turned on and off, because they would last longer. It's not true of fluorescence, which is what was used before. So that was a very nice outcome for that. Another small company, Digital Luminous, has been working on distribution warehouses, high bays, freezer buildings, basically, where they store refrigerated goods. And they've created specialized fixtures just for those types of environments where not only the motion sensor, but you can actually track electrical use. And in this graph down below here, you're seeing what the electrical usage profile looks like over a period of time, which is it's the accumulation of different rooms within one facility. And they were able to cut electricity use by well over 80%, even 90% in many cases, because of the additional intelligence that they were adding to the device. Now, this is another very small company. It's actually still a startup, which is looking at location. So the idea is if you have a smartphone, you can walk through a facility. The lights are actually not just emitting the pure light, which is illumination. They're also communicating. So they're able to be pulsed in such a way that you can actually communicate with this device. You can communicate with your smartphone through the camera, or you can use a standard RF Wi-Fi type system or Bluetooth. And so what does this enable? So this is where it gets sort of really, really interesting, is that you can now tie that into social media. You can now tie that into retail presence. The light can identify you, it can identify where you are, so you know where you are, and the retail store knows where you are. Now that brings up a whole host of other things too. But people often, as witnessed by Facebook, Google, and many others, are willing to give up the privacy if they get enough value out of it. I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's happening, and it's going to happen. And so that's a really interesting thing where you're doing location, but then it's tying into a host of other applications. Now here's one that's already very controversial. This is a company that is making fixtures. These are already installed in Newark Airport. They have a number of them there that have integral cameras and data sensors built into the fixtures themselves. So you have LEDs providing light, you have cameras and other things. So this really brings up questions of privacy and security. This is something that's very interesting, though, because now it doesn't just sense you. It's not like you're standing in front of a freezer and it turns on because it knows that you, Kevin Dowling, are standing in front of a freezer and really looking for that frozen pizza. This is actually potentially tracking you through an airport by not only monitoring emissions from phones, but also from just observing you, doing face recognition and other things. So this is I think there's a TV show called Person of Interest, which sort of talks about the way people can be tracked very easily today. And this brings it to really a different level because every room in every building has a light source in it. This is Top of the Rock, if you've ever been up there at the top of Rockefeller Center. There was an installation there. I haven't been there in a few years. In fact, I don't know if it's still there or not. It is still there?
It doesn't look this good anymore.
Those darn LEDs. So in this facility, the system could track you, and there's actually a graphic on the side over in the corner showing in real time that it's actually tracking you. So as you walk through the facility, and as you move through the facility, these representations of you, which are very simple avatars, they're cones essentially, are also tracking where you're moving. And this is meant as sort of a fun, interactive thing. So if you move around and jump around, it actually shows that you're doing that, and the lights respond to you. So it's a very interactive installation in that sense. This is amazingly complex to put in and set up 10 years ago. Today you could do it for a fraction of the cost and do it far more easily than you could then. But it just brought up the idea of being able to do really cool and interactive systems. Now this is a bit of a tangent to LEDs, but it's Paul Debevec at USC has done some amazing work over the years, and he built a number of what are called light stages. And I had a chance to work with him on a few of the early light stages where we used LED sources and essentially built a large geodesic dome. You can see one of the earlier small ones here. And he's been involved a lot with computer graphics and large blockbuster movies, basically. And what the light stage is capable of is replicating light sources anywhere in the world. So if you're walking in a Mediterranean sunset on a beach, this can create the same look, so we can now composite her directly into that movie under those same conditions so the lighting appears real. In many cases, CGI doesn't look quite real. You know something's slightly off, but you can't put your finger on it. It's often because of lighting. And so what Paul had done was recreate the ability to do lighting on people and objects that look very natural in that particular setting. But one of the most interesting things is, too, you can build complete 3D models of people using this by sequencing the lights in a proper way. And these 3D models can be then used to create essentially synthetic actors. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on. I don't think there's anything malevolent about doing a light stage for CGI purposes. And Paul's done some really fascinating research and very well deserved. So the last thing, I'm going to take you through a quick sequence of pictures, and I want you to think about all of the things you just saw in terms of what LEDs can do, with, the energy saving, lighting, and so forth, all the way to what they can be, which is essentially a way in which you can integrate networks, digital communications, sensing, and more into a light fixture in a room. So every room in every building has a light source in it. And over time, and every city, of course, you start to aggregate this. Look at all the light sources. This is the entire East Coast. You can see New York over on the right-hand side there with Long Island, pretty well lit up. And then the entire country, and really the world. And every one of those light sources that's causing that light emission to be observed by a camera in orbit will eventually become LEDs. There's no doubt about it. With incandescent sources already being pushed aside, LEDs reducing in price, people want to save energy, they'll want to use them. And so what can we do with the power of, not the electrical power, but the power of what the LED is capable of, how we can network them, how we can communicate using them, how they can communicate with each other, mesh networks throughout a facility. And what does that mean for all of this when all of those become LED lights, when it all becomes digital? So I'll leave you with that question, and I think there's probably something to discuss on the panel as well. Thank you.